Chris Davies from The Guardian, Gergely, Dudás, and Irina, Nedeva. Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to take the floor after the President Wałęsa. Something, well, which means a lot to me. Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, the journalism has a lot of problems in this part of Europe, but not only in this part of Europe. And as you know, there is almost no free media in Hungary. In Poland, public broadcasters are being taken over by the government and turned into propaganda broadcasters. In France, Germany, United Kingdom, there's a lot of political pressure on media, and the media are, well, struggling with that. The reason for this practice is quite clear. The journalists today stand in the first line resisting, independent journalists, I mean, they stand in the first line resisting all those attempts to destroy democracy, destroy the liberal order, and to they defend democracy, they defend the freedom of the speech. So we need to talk about how to defend the free media, how to defend journalism, and that's why we gathered here, and we want to discuss this issue with my prestigious and renowned friends. Let me introduce my colleagues. Ms. Irina Nedeva came from Bulgaria. She's the chairwoman of Bulgarian Association of European Journalists. Also, she worked as a reporter, as a radio and television journalist. Mr. Chris Davies is a Warsaw-based correspondent of The Guardian, and he also writes for Observer, used to write for Foreign Policy, tabloid magazine Politico Europe, and he's also a columnist at paper where I work in Gazeta Wyborcza. And last but not least, Gergely Dudás. He's now an independent media expert. Previously, he was the editor-in-chief of the most influential and biggest independent online portal, index.hu. My name is Bartosz Wieliński. I'm a foreign editor of Gazeta Wyborcza. I've been previously the correspondent in Berlin. So, dear colleagues, let's start after this short invitation. Let us start talking about the situation in our countries. Well, the situation in Poland is quite clear. The government subordinated all the public media in this country, fired more than 200 journalists who used to work there, hired new, eager activists who present, the world in black and white colors, claiming that the government is doing the great job and the opposition is this bad. And George Soros, European Union, Angela Merkel, Franz Timmermans, those are the enemies of the people in Poland. So we have the Russian-style propaganda in public media and public radio and public television. But what is good? The government was not able to take control over the private media. So the Gazeta Wyborcza remains the rampart of democracy and freedom of the media. Newsweek, TVN, television, we still resist all of those attempts to take control over us. We'll see how it's going to look like after the elections in this year. But the fact is that the Prime Minister, Mateusz Morawiecki, considers media as the opponents. He said that publicly, that his opponents has media. That's media being used by the opponents of this government, which of course is a bullshit. But let's talk about the situation in countries of my colleagues. Gergely, I'd like to ask you, how did it happen that there is no independent media in Hungary? Please explain us. How could it be possible in a country of European Union, in a country which was leading the charge in changing, transforming Eastern Europe after 1989?
Well, it happened fast in the last couple of years. But to be honest, the Hungarian media was never really in a good shape. I mean, right after the fall of the communist era, in the early 1990s, we had some cultural wars in Hungary, which now called media war. To be exact, the first media war, and that means that there were many others. Basically, in the early 90s, it was about the public media, how the government can control the public media, and it is still a problem in Hungary, it's not so much a debate now that what to do with the public media, because it's absolutely seized by the government and the ruling party. So basically, it works like a communication department of the government. On the other hand, what really changed in the last couple of years, that the so-called independent media almost vanished in Hungary, and it's a multi-sided problem, because there were basic business reasons behind that. I mean, the economical crisis in 2008 and 2009 hit the media all around the world, of course, but in Hungary too. So it was an easy target to buy by oligarchs, for example, in the last couple of years, and that's what happened. But in the last couple of years, I mean, in the last 2-3 years, the whole process was going just crazy. You could not have a research about the situation of the media landscape in Hungary, which was not outdated by the time it was published. So it really happened fast. The basic situation now is that the public media is controlled absolutely by the government. The commercial media, which should be more independent, has been bought by oligarchs, almost 10 of them, or more than 10 of them in the last couple of years. And many media outlets, there is almost 500 medium, but you have to think not only about daily newspapers or weekly political newspapers, but about, I don't know, cooking magazines or so everything. Almost 500 medium were owned by a dozen government-related oligarchs. And a couple of months ago, they said that all media we offer it to newly created foundation. And they just centralized the whole thing. And basically, it was clear that they are cooperating not only in an economical way, but in an editorial meaning. So they just had meetings, of course, and they cooperated in a propaganda machine. But now it became obvious that that there's one head of this organization, and it's basically one organization. Which is now more than 500 or around 500 mediums in Hungary, and it's a pro-government foundation who has it.
Well, Irina, the situation in Bulgaria seems to be, well, not so bad as in Hungary, but you have serious problems with the collusion between the business and the politics, and the media suffers. The freedom of the media suffers from that.
Well, I would like to focus your attention to one paradox. When we speak about Bulgaria, we see that the commercial media is very much pro-governmental. Everybody could say why it is so, because usually the commercial media could be more independent in their editorial content, but obviously the business model is made in such a way that makes the owners of private and commercial media so much dependent in their other business to the government, whatever the government is. So just imagine it's like Hungary in this latest moment of the development of this seizure of the free media by the government. But what we see in the public media is quite interesting. We see that if there is a regulation, if there is at least a model that says in the legislation that the regulatory body of the public media should be not directly connected with only one party or only with one governmental party, it gives a certain autonomy. And for us, the journalists in Bulgaria, it's very interesting to observe these autonomy pockets. Pockets that are made in the legislation that could be used for much more autonomous editorial content. And in Bulgaria especially, we see that the public radio, which is probably not so much in the interests of politicians, because they like to show their faces on the TV screen, they don't care so much about the radio, and we see the paradox that the public radio could be more critical to the government than all the other media, included the commercial media. In the commercial media, we have a problem with interconnection, also in the editorial content. There are some suspicions that a big part of the private print newspapers is basically owned by one and the same businessman who is also a politician. By the way, a politician from the opposition party, which is quite interesting as well. But all this big conglomerate of media, they basically produce, copy-paste one and the same content, although the owner is saying openly that he doesn't own all of these different newspapers. You see, it's like tracing the content. You can find interdependence of the editorial content, especially in the nasty smearing campaigns all these commercial media are conducting, mainly against small opposition parties that are even not in the parliament, or what they do is basically they attack journalists, they attack independent, very small online outlets that are dealing with investigative stuff, for instance, or they attack organizations like the one I'm representing here, the Association of European Journalists. They blame all these different, very small players, by the way, of being so-called foreign agents or Sorosuites. You know very well this type of smearing campaigns, but in result, it deteriorates incredibly the trust toward the media and framed everything like a battle, like an info war between different media that are connected in this public imagination with different oligarchs. And this is a very useful tool to basically to kill all the media and to say that there is no hope. But I don't believe that.
Of course. Well, the hope dies last. Chris, how is it in Great Britain in time of, well, increasingly fierce debates over the Brexit? How this discussion in your country, influenced the media freedom?
It is a very interesting subject. I've actually looked at these questions from both sides, because before I worked as a journalist, I worked in the Houses of Parliament. And during the time I was there were two big things going on. One, a huge scandal broke out about journalists, mainly from tabloid newspapers, hacking phones and abusing their power, publishing unsubstantiated accusations against people, ruining their lives, and then it turned out that these accusations weren't true. And there was a big process of judicial inquiry about whether there should be regulation of the press. That collapsed in the end, but we had a big discussion. But the main issue that I was involved in at that time, I worked for the head of the Intelligence and Security Committee of Parliament, which is the committee which oversees the British intelligence agencies. And at that time was when we had the Snowden affair, when this huge, massive leak of intelligence material. And because the committee whose chair I worked for at the time was the only independent, i.e. not government body, which also had access to the inside information about what was leaked and what was exposed, I became very involved in this debate about media responsibility and irresponsibility. And in both those cases, the debate was not so much about government pressure on the media, but actually about the limits of media irresponsibility. And obviously in different countries, we have these two different things going on. In Hungary, you have the issue more of the government clamping down and pressuring on the media. In Poland, for example, we have the opposite problem in many ways, which is in some quarters are almost completely feral media, which most importantly coordinates its actions with the political authorities. We're also seeing the same thing in America with what's happened with Fox News. Some of you will have seen a very interesting long article in New Yorker about the connections, not just institutional and personal, but actually narrative connections between the current White House and Fox News and so on. So a very quick Polish example before I move on to Britain. I mean, when I reported on, as I'm sure you all know, last year there was a huge eruption of a big controversy about legislation to limit the false attribution of Nazi German crimes to Poles or the Polish nation, and this caused a huge international incident. And I wrote a story about how Auschwitz, the Auschwitz Museum, had become the object of a basically a online harassment campaign, and this was spilling over into harassment of guides on the site and so on. And one of the things that made the abuse the worst was someone had written a letter to a right-wing media outlet, w Polityce, or w Sieci is the magazine, claiming that describing a story in which this person says that he went to Auschwitz and that the guide at Auschwitz refused to acknowledge that any of the SS guards at Auschwitz were German. And the guide was saying, no, none of them were German, they were from different countries, but none of them were from Germany. And this person described how he had confronted the guide and there'd been a big thing, and then they'd called the police and he'd been thrown out. And Polityce published this letter. Auschwitz investigated it, and they established that it was completely untrue. Not just that the specific claim about the guide not saying the SS guards were German, but simply the entire thing had been confabulated. And this had provoked a huge amount of pressure on the museum. That was basically a year ago. I just checked this morning, and that's still there. That claim is still there. And they know it's not true because Auschwitz investigated it and told them this is completely untrue. So you've got these two extremes. One is media being harassed by the authorities, and the other hand, you have the media harassing people themselves. So we're between these two poles. So and when it came to the Snowden thing, the Guardian was one of the main newspapers reporting on the Snowden revelations. And actually at that time, I was writing speeches, not attacking, but in some ways criticizing the Guardian for some of their reporting on this subject, because they got a few things wrong. And it was a very interesting subject, whether when you've got in a democratic system, it's simply security services sometimes need to operate operations which are secret, because otherwise they wouldn't work. And so what are the limits of the media responsibilities in terms of revealing secret operations which are designed to protect people? I didn't know that at the time, but turned out later I would become a Guardian reporter. But so I've been on both sides. In Britain, as always, the problems are often more subtle. They're not as obvious, they're not as dramatic, but it doesn't mean they're not there. I mean, Britain is famous for a kind of soft corruption more than hard corruption. Anyone who's watched Yes Minister or Yes Prime Minister will know these kind of little compromises in which institutions don't function as they should. And I think the story of the British media, particularly as it relates to Brexit, is best illustrated by the career of Boris Johnson, who a lot of people in Britain call Boris, which they shouldn't do because he's not Madonna and he's not Jesus. He doesn't belong in that one name category. But he's managed to do that. Boris Johnson was a journalist on the Times after he left university, but was fired for making up a quote. And then he got taken on by the Daily Telegraph, and he was sent to Brussels. And what he did was he spotted a gap in the market, which was that until he came along, news from Brussels in the British media was extremely boring, because Brussels is a pretty boring place generally. Not always, but particularly in that time, whenever it would have been. And he realized that he could produce stories which played into British prejudices about Europe and about the Europeans. And he started to produce very entertaining material from Brussels. And the rest of the press corps started to get very suspicious. He said, "How do you get hold of these entertaining stories when there are no entertaining stories in Brussels?" And it turned out that a lot of it was, some of it was made up, some of it was completely dishonest, but it was nearly always intellectually dishonest material. And another journalist who was in Brussels at that time, around the early 90s, actually a couple of years ago wrote a very interesting, he was the Times' correspondent in Brussels, so he was reporting for the newspaper that Johnson had been thrown out of. Wrote an article recently describing how it didn't just have an effect on the Telegraph's coverage of Brussels, but all of the editors in London started to say to their correspondents in Brussels, "Well, why are you not able to produce what Johnson is producing? Why do you keep producing this boring stuff?" And journalists started either imitating this dishonest reporting, or the newspapers would just stop running it. So he in many ways, and Johnson is famous for a quote in which he described his reporting from Brussels as like throwing a stone over the English Channel and hearing the glass roofs of the glass houses smashing, and how that gave him a sense of excitement. So this complete lack of responsibility had an effect on the reporting, and it had in the long term. And we're talking about mainstream, so-called respectable outlets here. We're not, the Times and the Telegraph are supposed to be, in this case, it was the Telegraph. And what was interesting is, of course, Johnson went on to become a politician, and as a politician, he reaped what he sowed. He actually was able to benefit from some of the misunderstandings and the ignorance and the prejudice which he himself had spread, and he was able to exploit this. And to take the story full circle, he became, as the champion of Euroscepticism in Britain, the Telegraph, the newspaper for which he had written this bad material, actually has become almost his mouthpiece. I mean, it's extraordinary the extent to which a respectable newspaper has debased itself in the service of one politician. And now he's on the front page of the Daily Telegraph constantly. He has a very well-paid weekly column, and so he's now using the newspaper, now not as a reporter but as a columnist, to make his political arguments. And this, what used to be a respectable newspaper, has somehow allowed itself to be subjugated to a single politician, not even to a party. I mean, to the personal campaign of one person. So there's many different things, but I just wanted to bring out this slightly different kind of intellectual and professional corruption, which is very British, which is maybe not so obvious, but which over the long term has an equally corrosive and damaging effect on society?
Okay. Well, 20 years ago, we had opportunity to get a letter from the angry reader or get a phone call, and we could be just yelled by somebody who was, well, not agreeing with our reporting. Now we confront the huge amount of the hate speech and even threats over social networks, over the internet. Could you provide us with your personal, well, experiences and the way how you deal with that, Gergely? For sure you got some bad comments over the network.
Well, I get to it right, but I just wanted to comment.
Okay, feel free.
That I think we are talking about parallel phenomena. So basically, as I said, the Hungarian media situation was never good. It was always biased, and even the commercial media was biased. And for example, as Breitbart or Fox News, because of the connections between politicians and journalists, because of just shared values, or you can go on. On the other hand, we have a lot of problems with our own work. So, I mean, when we talk about how we should defend free media, the bottom line is we have to do our job better, because many times we try to do a good job, but we are misleading our audience, and that's another problem. And of course, yeah, we always talk about how the government has seized the Hungarian media, and it's a big problem, of course, because of the enormous measures, you know. So it's like, I don't know, nothing we've seen before, and people just cannot avoid this propaganda machine. So basically, you can not choose not to watch public TV because they send you letters. There are billboards everywhere in the country, so it's not an option to avoid it. But still, we have some free media. I mean, media which so outlets which can do their job without any political influence, and the question is how they do it. So I just think that we all have the same problems, but the levels are different. Yeah.
The hate speech.
The hate speech. I hate hate speech. I don't know. It's probably another thing that in Hungary, hate speech. I think it's just getting to be standard. Mm-hmm. So it's a difficult situation because we have a government who goes on with a xenophobic campaign for years now, and you know, how do you decide what hate speech is? Because it seems to be very clear that what the government propaganda is doing is a kind of hate speech. And I think it's a much bigger problem that now we have it as a standard political, I don't know, propaganda or communication, than as you would speak about hate speech a couple of years ago. That what do you do when you see it in some comments on your article or on Facebook posts?
Okay. Irina, your experiences, is it the same in Bulgaria and Hungary, that hate speech is normal speech now?
Well, hate speech is normalized mainly by the politicians. Also politicians from the ruling coalition, which means that you can hear on the media broadcasting such nasty attacks against minorities, against LGBT people, against Roma communities. So it became more and more normal that the politicians pronounce direct hate speech. Of course, there are human rights organizations that are immediately trying to sue the politicians. There are court procedures, things like that, sometimes successful, sometimes not so successful or prolonged in time. The problem is that, personally speaking, when do I start to worry? I will give you an example. I don't worry when the Association of European Journalists is attacked almost every day in the tabloid press. What worries me is when, in certain moments, my father, who lives not close to me, calls me and asks me, "Are you okay?" And I'm saying, "Why? Why you ask me with such a worry in your voice?" And he says, "Well, a colleague of mine just sent me a copy of a newspaper that is again saying that you are Soros or foreign agents or something like this." And I said, "Okay, Daddy, you know it's part of this info war." This, of course, worries us. Of course, there are many attempts to make harassment against women journalists in Bulgaria. It's even worse for regional journalists and regional investigative reporters, because when we are talking about the capital city, about big media, we are somehow far away from the people, unfortunately, but it is true. We are somehow protected by the fact that we are living in the capital city. But when it is up to a small town where everybody knows your family, it's really very difficult for these colleagues of mine who try to do regional investigative journalism. And I have to make a connection with the question of responsibility and ethical reporting, and this awful thing of a journalist becoming a politician or media that could be used as a blackmailing machine against some other groups in the society, because it's part of the problem. Unfortunately, it is hopeless. This is in the frame of hopeless things around the media. When journalists dream to become PR officers of government or of commercial companies, this is, by my point of view, the worst. Yeah. So to imagine that a journalist becomes a politician is something that should alarm all our nature of people who believe that media should be free and independent. So this is the first point to recognize and to alarm yourself if a journalism is used for a political campaigning or for journalists to become politicians. And the other thing is a politician to become a journalist, because we have seen in Bulgaria both careers. So career path of reporters and journalists is not a very bright, there is not a very bright path in this. And the question is what to do against. Could we restore the feeling and the image of a really distant look toward our reality, not being part of political campaigning or commercial, industrial or business interests, really to keep this distant position, to be able to go and to meet the reality, but not to be involved in one or other particular interest groups in the reality. This is the biggest question I think we are facing, and the answer is self-regulation and the idea that, yes, this role of reporter and the journalistic approach to the reality keeping distance and balancing the distance with going into the reality is the biggest question in front of us, I think.
I see. Chris, while living in Warsaw, writing columns for Gazeta Wyborcza, you must have, encountered some outburst of hate speech from our dearest readers from the right side.
Actually, I have to say that's not been my experience. First of all, the right wing doesn't read my columns because Wyborcza is behind a paywall. So I get a sea of love every week from my enlightened Wyborcza readers who almost all agree with every single word I say, and who write to me saying how much they love my column and how much they wish I should be writing more.
That could be arranged.
So my bigger problem is I'm being flattered and praised too much. So when it comes to that particular aspect, that hasn't been a problem. Simply they don't read it. They can't read it because they don't have a Wyborcza subscription.
Readers of The Guardian.
Okay, so that's the first thing. Secondly, so I'll say a few words about my personal experience and then about the issue generally. The first thing I published anywhere on anything was a long read essay in The Guardian. That's 5,000 words. So that's very long. Yeah, that's 3 full pages of a newspaper. And it was an essay about the current party, where they come from, and basically analyzing and criticizing, everything about them. And so no one had any idea who I was. And then suddenly I'd published this big thing. I said that Kaczynski looked like a mix between Karl Lagerfeld and Yoda, which became a kind of meme that went around the internet. So there was a big thing. And I remember this feeling of suddenly people trying to find out who you are. You know, that you can almost feel them digging. But my background, I think, for the trolls is a little bit complicated because, first of all, there's a standard kind of approach. If you're foreign and you write about Poland, and they don't, if they agree with you, then you're the greatest authority on the country there's ever been. And if they disagree with you, then you have no right to express an opinion. You're a colonialist telling Poles about their own country. You don't have any idea what you're talking about, so on and so forth. And if you're Polish, then you're a traitor, or your parents were this, or your parents were that. But because I'm half British and half Polish, I don't fit into either category, and they really didn't know what to do. The other thing was because so one of the standard things is, as I said, they find out what your parents did or who they were or what the job they had or whatever. And my particular circumstances, my father is quite well known in Poland as a British historian of Poland who wrote books about Polish history at a time when the rest of the world wasn't really paying any attention. And so the Polish right, maybe not now, but used to love him. And so they're kind of confused and conflicted. And I think they just don't know what to think and they don't know what to do. And so, honestly, from my personal experience, it really hasn't been that bad. I've got a Polish mother, which gives me the right to push back and say I've got a right to say what I want, that I care about this country. I'm not just some foreigner coming in and telling people what to think. And then, because my father, rightly or wrongly, I get some slack. And the best example of that was I noticed the worst abuse I would get was from Australia. And it was Poles living in Australia, often who had moved in the 80s and had been sitting in Australia consuming right-wing media for really a long time and getting angrier and angrier and angrier sitting in Australia. And they were the most abusive. And I had one guy who was writing me all this personal abuse and, all this stuff. And then halfway through sending, but these were emails, like emails written to me. These weren't just kind of tweets. He suddenly realized that he loved first of all, he realized who my father was, and secondly, that he loved my father and worshipped him. And he suddenly started writing apologies, sending his regards to my family. Sorry, you know, as a Pole, I'm hot-headed, but really, and he ended up saying, I wish you all the best in your career and all this stuff. So people can turn, so anyway, the point is with my personal circumstance, it's different. It's way worse for women. Definitely, and my female colleagues in other newspapers, some of the stories they tell me is way worse. But in general, once you've muted 30 or 40 accounts on Twitter, in my experience, it goes away. And some of the comments are so, I mean, genuinely stupid that they actually end up helping you, because with the Guardian articles, you say, for example, supporters of the government are conspiratorial-minded, and some of them express anti-Semitic views. And then they'll comment saying, how dare you say that? If you think that, you must be a Jew who, you know, and they end up like abusing you with I'm not Jewish, but that doesn't stop them. You know, all they do is confirm what you say. And then the non-Polish Guardian readers who don't know exactly what to think, then my point is proved, because the trolls always end up saying what I say they're going to say, because what they say is always the same. So that's my personal experience. We've clearly got two different dynamics going on. One is the threat of hate speech directed by politicians against journalists. For example, I reported from Bratislava after the Jan Kuciak murder. Of course, we don't know exactly whether there was a link, but clearly what that exposed was that for a long time, Slovak politicians had been describing journalists as whatever, hyenas and prostitutes and things like that. On the other hand, we have a problem of journalists or media directing hate speech against politicians. We're in Gdańsk. People in Gdańsk don't need to be told about the risk of media hate campaigns against politicians. Same thing happened in Britain with a politician being murdered during the Brexit campaign. In other words, it's not a question of a threat to journalists or a threat to politicians. It's everyone as being a threat to everyone else. And so it's clearly you can't get rid of hate speech without getting rid of hate. There was a slightly pointless, I think, discussion in Poland after the Adamowicz murder. How can we stop hate speech? Well, no, you can't just stop the speech, because the speech is an expression of a feeling which is a lot harder to stop. In my view, I know maybe we'll move on to it, the rise of hate and hate speech, to me, is very, very clearly linked to social media, which I think is the worst thing that's happened to us. I think social media is a total disaster. I wish it had never been invented. I might as well say it now. I think you should delete your Facebook accounts. Why anyone is on Instagram, I have no idea. You're wasting your time. I mean, grow up. And although there are some opportunities at the margins, there are some good things, that social media has been a catastrophe for our democracies, and actually for us personally, for our mental health. It's an absolute disaster. And maybe I'm overstating my case slightly, but I think we have to start realizing, we have to wake up and see that social media is a problem to be managed, and not an opportunity, and only an opportunity at the margins. Because this question of hate is clearly connected to it. I'm not saying it's the only thing, but it's clearly making it and many other things worse. And I'm being slightly provocative, but I'm putting it out there because I think not enough people are saying it. Delete your Facebook account. You don't need it. You may think you need it, but you don't.
Yeah, well, that's the issue I also wanted to raise, because, well, for us living in a country when authoritarianism is, growing, we are in danger of losing our freedoms. The internet seems to be, this safe harbor when we could just find shelter, when we could remain free and publish whatever we want. So, Gergely, would you agree with Chris saying that social media is a mess, and does it help us? us living in a countries, well, with such a problems?
I agree with Chris in a lot of aspects. So I don't like social media, and I think journalism is endangered by social media, and the masses are deceived by social media. So it's a problem, but I don't think it can be solved. So I think the question should be how can we live and how can we deal with social media? And again, I think how can we do our job better, acknowledging that social media is there and will be there. And the problem is, I think that the media has so much became so much dependent on social media in many ways. I mean, economically, for example. But on the other hand, we started to generate Facebook compatible articles, or we started to write about things which we know is only interesting for people who want to just entertain themselves. So the media is getting infotainment is not a new word, of course. Back in the 80s, when the commercial TVs became popular, or this liberalization went through in Western Europe, infotainment was a key word for many media conferences. Not that I've been there, but so. The question is how we deal with social media, what do we put there, how we make our business depend on social media, and how we try to focus on media literacy and to almost educate our readers or our consumers to reach us not through social media, and to make a difference, that if you see something on social media, how to accept it, or how to check it, or you have to be sure that from the independent media, from a journalist work, you got quality. But first of all, you have to make sure that you really give quality.
Irina, your view on the issue of social
well,
media?
I will try to disagree with Chris, although I know he's right. But I want to point out something else. Social media is there because there is a deficit, and the deficit is our common public space. We lost it somewhere, and social media comes to give us an illusion that the public space could exist. I don't like Facebook. I pretty much agree with the idea to delete my Facebook profile. Probably I will not, because I know how to, at least how to deal with it. But we have to take into consideration this need of sharing experiences. And your point about authoritarian situation. In the authoritarian situation, we need escapes. We need to have the ability to communicate content, and to communicate our wishes, dreams, and desires, and to become part of different communities, different groups, even resistance groups, for instance. So I do believe it's a way how we use it. It's a tool, and internet should stay free. And there are, I believe, plenty of options to do this. And I saw some of the posters in front, like giving opportunities to people to, for instance, to skill themselves, to make, to become more witty, for instance, if they go to a restaurant or to a hotel, to know who is behind, something like this. Great idea. It's like an investigative journalism, not in an article, but as your everyday life experience, because you can choose. You can choose what products products you buy and you consume. So I believe that the internet is an option, is a chance. It's not part of the problem. And social networking, maybe not Facebook, not this commercialized type of misusing the need of connecting, but there should be other ways. So do it smarter.
I mean, I absolutely agree. I mean, of course, it can't be uninvented, but it should be regarded a little bit like nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons can't be uninvented, but their existence should be managed, and they should be thought of. The starting point should be that it's bad, I think, rather than it's good. You know, I understand the dilemma because, I mean, I've reported, for example, I did a big thing about grassroots activist movements in Poland, and obviously this is replicated in lots of different places, which are small groups of people working on local issues like air quality or whatever, and that they're often quite isolated and lonely in smaller towns, smaller villages, and they're coordinating with each other and so on. But the bigger picture is that Polish democracy is a total mess at the moment. You know, I remember when I was studying Middle Eastern politics, masters during the Arab Spring, when I remember the reports on CNN was all about how America had invented a technology that would liberate the people of the world. I mean, that was the tone of the reporting. And I don't follow Egypt as closely as I did then, but I don't think it's worked out. I don't think it's worked out anywhere. So it's not of course it can't be uninvented, but the difference with nuclear weapons is basically none of us can do anything about the fact that technology exists. All I'm saying is a lot of people think they need it more than they do. And you joined these things. When it comes to Facebook, what I would urge people, if you really feel you need Facebook, delete your account and set up a new one. I mean, people need to start withdrawing their data from these organizations, because a lot of it you've given to them you know, for a service that they've convinced you that you need, but you don't really. So at the very least, you can delete your account, particularly if you've had one for 10 or... I had mine from 2016 until 2006 until a few months ago. At the very least, delete, and then if you want to be on it, start again with a fresh slate on a new email address, so you know, with as little stuff on that. I really strongly believe that it's making people absolutely miserable. There's a very interesting article on, I think, BBC Sport website about the head of the NBA said all of his players are absolutely miserable. These are young guys who trained all their life, join the NBA, and they get hammered every day by thousands of people, and they're completely miserable. And, you know, this may be a dramatic example, but I really think it's making us unhappy, and I think it's leading us to a collective mental health crisis. This addiction, isolation, all of these different things. I really think we need to start thinking of it as a threat to us that has to be managed in some way, rather than this wonderful thing that everyone has to be on, that you need to be on, because you don't. Nearly everyone here doesn't need to use it, hardly.
All right. Well, for the final round of questions to our panelists, so I must say I agree with you, but simply as a journalist...
You'll be tweeting in about 20 minutes' time.
Yes. Well, my fingers are sweating now because I haven't tweeted for 1 hour.
I just wanted to add that it's a great thing that, and to see how this issue is not so black and white, that you should delete it. That yes, of course, if you talk about the Arab Spring and what an important role Facebook had in that, then you can come to a conclusion that authoritarian regimes can be changed via social media. But on the other hand, we see that authoritarian regimes can be built, established.
That's what we're seeing now. Look at America.
Social media, but still, a guy from Azerbaijan sit here yesterday, and he talked about how the only way to communicate is almost social media. I mean, Facebook, YouTube, and all these platforms. So.
That's right. But and depending on the circumstances, it will be different. As I said, I'm clearly speaking about a situation in developed economies and democracies, that it's gone too far the other way, and actually it's threatening us. In other places, it may be a good thing. You know.
What's threatening us is
Sorry?
not what is threatening us and our democracies is not social media. I mean, it's only a platform. If you think about, that's why I talked about commercial TVs, because what's threatening us is the uneducated people, you know, and what you see on social media and what you see how they use social media and how can they be used by social media is about education. And
that's right, but that reminds you of the gun debate in America. Guns don't kill people, people do. Okay, but you know, it's still better to have fewer guns.
Well, so my role was limited just to asking the panelists to say something in this first discussion, but well, let's carry on. It's getting interesting.
Just a note: there are so many unheard voices. For instance, in Bulgaria, there are still taboo issues. And I think social media, I agree with all the argument about commercializing hate in Facebook, etc. But the concept of connecting people and giving them a platform is very essential when we still have taboo issues and communities that are not feeling free to express what they experience. Like, for instance, LGBTI issue in Bulgaria. It's very, still very dangerous for these people to speak out. So they are harassed all the time by the political establishment and also by the mainstream media and by really hate campaigns against these communities. So it's very essential for underrepresented groups. I'm just giving an example, but for underrepresented groups, minorities, to have a platform for sharing their own experience. And I do believe that internet could provide such tools, but I'm going back to my first point that all this comes because we already lost the public space, the common public space, and we live in this post paradise world when we do not face, we do not have a common ground. And that's why the most important is how to restore the idea of public space, public interest, and maybe public media. I keep thinking about the concept of public media, where the public media is obliged to keep all the voices heard. Something like this, simple as that.
Okay, so the final question to all the panelists, and ask you for the short answers because we are running out of time. Gergely, what are your hopes and your fears for this year, for the nearest future? The situation of media in Hungary will deteriorate, will improve? What's your prognosis?
Well, in the last couple of years, we always thought that the situation is so bad that it's impossible to wait for anything worse. But you know, it's always happening, so it's getting worse and worse, and probably it won't stop. You know, another question is whether how long the few left independent media outlets can survive. In an economical way, they can. I'm sure of it. But they probably have to find better solutions for the finances. But it's always a question that, for example, at index.hu, as you said, this is the biggest online medium in Hungary, and which has an audience of almost 1 million people per day, so it's really big. But as the current editor-in-chief said in an interview, they just don't know who the owner is, who the real owner is, and they just don't know what is going to happen to them. Now they can work without any political influence, but they say that they are in danger. So the question is whether, I don't know, after the European Parliament election or after we will have a local government election in the autumn, so whether there will be some steps to trying to take over any of the free medium left in Hungary. That's a big question.
Irina, the situation in your country will deteriorate or not?
I don't know. I try to be optimistic. Unfortunately, very much depends of the question of minority and majority. If whatever the political party wins the elections, if it has a full majority, or in the worst case, a constitutional majority, as in Hungary, it will definitely hit the democracy and the public space, but we are not going to face parliamentary elections probably soon. At the moment there is a governmental crisis. Maybe it will affect the European elections for the EU Parliament, but it depends. But this is the political part of my answer. On the other hand, I think for the media, the most essential is how to keep these pockets of autonomy and how to somehow to insist on a formal legislation that gives independence in the editorial content in the public media. And the third thing is that people should be educated. And there are many different ways of civic resistance to the state capture of the media, or to the commercial capture of the commercial media as well. And there are some tools, civic tools, like boycotting what you don't like. People should simply know how to deal with this wild, how to manage in this wild forest. And I still believe that media could provide education and could provide also information that is important for citizens to manage in this in the wild.
Chris, I'm not going to ask you about the future of your country, because due to all turbulent debates on Brexit, we don't know what's going to happen this year. But well, tell us at least, what is your prognosis for Poland, your second country? What's going to be with our media system? Is it going to improve or fall down?
I was watching the Polish news yesterday. As we know, it was announced recently that the European Commission had initiated proceedings about the new procedures for disciplining Polish judges, that the government now directly appoints the people who appoint the disciplinary officials, which quite rightly, it's quite obvious that this is a violation of judicial independence, and that not only is the tools that have been established are contrary to basic democratic principles, but the way in which they've have been used already is proof that that they're being used in as a clear threat to judicial independence. And without the judicial independence, you don't have rule of law, and without rule of law, you don't have democracy. And this was announced, and the Minister of Justice's response, because there have been a couple of instances of judge stealing a drill, stealing a pair of trousers or something, and he said, well, if people...
Sausage.
Yeah, piece of sausage, whatever. He said, well, if people want want their judges to be allowed to steal a drill, then that's up to them. And I remember thinking, this argumentation is so, I'm sorry to use this word, so primitive,
So it is.
that I remember thinking to myself, if that argument, because the point is that the judges who are being disciplined are not judges who stole a drill or stole a piece of sausage, but are judges who were referring quite rightly cases to the questions to the European Court of Justice or whatever. If you're persuaded by that argument that they're protecting the Polish people from judges who steal pieces of sausages, then you've got a lot bigger problem than your specific media arrangements, because this comes back to actually a much bigger, deeper question. In my estimation, actually, Polish journalism is pretty good, actually, and although the public media is a joke, there is a lot of competition. There are, Wyborcza, Polityka, and also some, Gazeta Prawna, for example, which is not really involved in the war, in the fight, or let's say, but is a reputable newspaper. Polish media in many ways is pretty good. The problem is that the investigative journalists do their job. They publish substantiated allegations and scandals, and no one reacts. Now, is that the media's? Well, maybe the media contributes to polarization. Well, it definitely contributes to polarization. But when I see an argument being made by senior politicians, which are so demonstrably primitive and stupid and irrelevant, and so the issue is often bigger than the particular arrangements. The other thing that's slightly depressing is, unfortunately, and this gives me no pleasure in saying it as a Polish citizen, if Poland was a truly sovereign, independent country, it wouldn't be a democracy now, because almost every intervention that has stopped the worst excesses has been foreign. It was the European Court of Justice which stopped the destruction of Białowieża Forest. It was a European Court of Justice that protected the Supreme Court from being purged. It was American financial investment in private media which stopped the main private television station, almost certainly, and not just that, from being taken over.
And the American ambassador close.
And the American ambassador. And it was the American and Israeli reaction which stopped really the worst excesses of the restrictions on Holocaust discussion. So you have a very unfortunate situation, and it really it's very painful for someone who cares a lot about Poland, that a truly sovereign Poland wouldn't be a democratic country, I think, by now. And this creates a dynamic which is, it seems to be, foreign safeguards are the only thing that are stopping the worst excesses in this country at the moment. I don't mean generally, but at the moment. And that means that they can easily be blamed as being foreign. Right? So it's always the foreigners are stopping us from doing what they're doing. And actually, it's true, they are. It just happens to be that the foreigners are right in this instance. And this is creating a very bad dynamic whereby the many millions of Poles who are committed to a proper democratic arrangements are being protected by safeguards from outside of their own country. And I think that's a dangerous dynamic in the long term. The internal safeguards have to be strengthened because, as we've seen, for example, with the judiciary, although there are a lot of really good people fighting, it hasn't been enough. And I'm sorry if that's a little bit pessimistic, but it's the case, I think.
Well, that's all. We need to finish. We fit the schedule. Dear colleagues, I do thank you for your contribution to this panel. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention.